Access to Democracy is made possible thanks to the following organizations. Recalibra Health, a new nationwide telehealth platform designed to provide safe and effective health and wellness products at affordable prices. Available products include compound GLP-1 for weight loss, as well as multiple medications for men's and women's health and hair loss, all administered under the direct supervision of expert physicians, nurse practitioners, and physician assistants. Visit recalibrahealth.com for more information. Sheridan and Dulas, PA, a family and criminal defense law firm, has been serving clients in Dakota County and throughout Minnesota for over 40 years. Ranked a Tier 1 Best Law Firm by U.S. News & World Report every year since 2009. Sheridan and Dulas are here to help you in your most difficult life circumstances. Learn more at ssdpa.com. Established in 2007 and based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, 45th Parallel Distillery was among the first 50 micro distilleries in the United States. All aspects of production occur at their facility. If you're interested in learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check their website and plan a visit to tour their facility and taste their spirits. 45thParallelDistillery.com. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has been proudly serving its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Access to Democracy. I'm your host, Steve Francisco. Thank you for joining us today for this program. A topic which has been in the news quite a bit in recent times has been the subject of disinformation. And particularly today, we're going to focus on the subject of political disinformation. And we have an expert on this subject with us today, Professor Bob Groven, assistant professor or associate professor and co-chair the Department of Communication Studies, Film and Media at Augsburg University in Minneapolis. Bob Groven, welcome to Access to Democracy.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
So I understand, just by way of background, that you have coached competitive speech and debate for over 25 years.
Yeah.
You have received numerous awards, including the University of Minnesota Rhetoric Department Excellence in Teaching Award twice, the Minnesota State High School League Section Coach of the Year twice, and the Minnesota Debate Teachers Coach of the Year, and that you also earned master's degrees and a law degree from the University of Minnesota.
That is correct. You got it.
What drew you to the subject of speech, debate, rhetoric? How did you become interested in this?
Well, if you ask my parents that, they will tell you that all I've ever done is argue. So what I've done for the rest of my career is just an extension of what I did when I was like 6 years old. But more constructively, I started doing speech and debate when I was in the 7th grade. And I got recruited to the team by an amazing teacher, a guy named George Merritt, who was both the speech and debate coach for the middle school that I was in, Murray Middle School, but also he unfortunately was dying of cancer at the time that he was coaching us, and he taught a class on death and dying, which I took, and he encouraged debates even in the class of death and dying. And it was just such a remarkable experience. It made such an impression on me that I think it kind of drew me into the activity, and I've never left. So,
you know what, that's a good reminder, I think, Bob. So many of us have had teachers or mentors that really stood out. And I've had several exceptional professors that I had coming through college. And even before I went to college, teachers at Roosevelt High School in Minneapolis who really got me thinking and interested and engaged in issues like political science and economics and things. It can never be understated how important those kinds of teachers are.
Yeah. In college, I did speech and debate also in college, and we had just an amazing coaching staff, professors there like Fred Sternhagen and John Burtis, who were just they really taught us to take ourselves seriously and to perform at a national caliber, because in college debate, there are no divisions. So Concordia Moorhead, we were still competing against Harvard and Princeton and Michigan and Emory. And that was a really invaluable experience for me, because it taught me to compare my abilities against those of the best all across the country. And our coaches were amazing at preparing us for that. So, yeah.
When I was in high school, as I mentioned to you before the program, I participated in speech and debate at my alma mater, Minneapolis Roosevelt High School. Was very happy to do so and learned so much, because I think speech and debate, it really helps you organize your thoughts and to focus on how you develop a persuasive argument, because that's how you get points in the competition, right?
Yep, that's right. And I like you talking about Roosevelt, because I'm also the director of the Minnesota Urban Debate League, and we actually have a program in debate at Roosevelt right now, and they're doing very well. And I think for me, when I think about what speech and debate does, the one sort of misconception I would want to offset is that people think about it and they picture kids talking. And that's obviously an important part, but it's really just like the tip of the iceberg. 9/10 of what happens is the preparation before you get to the tournament, you start talking. And so when people are amazed by some of our assessment statistics, where they'll say something like, that 1 year in debate will advance a student 2 years in reading comprehension, will increase their attendance by an enormous degree, will get them to college. Why does that happen? And the reason is because it's not just about the talking. It's about the thinking, it's about organization, it's about reading comprehension, it's about critical analysis, right? All of that is what we're teaching the kids before they ever show up at a tournament.
Right.
So.
I'm really glad you made those points, especially about the importance of preparation, because I think, it's a skill that served me well when I later went to law school. And, the ability to put an argument together, that you not only need to understand your own position and be able to identify the weaknesses perhaps in that position, but you need to understand the other side of the argument too.
Yes, that's
and
so
people
important.
often say, well, there's two sides to every coin or every argument. Actually, there are sometimes multiple sides, many different sides, or many different nuances to a particular argument that one might make.
Yes, and in fact, it's funny, if you were to ask me 20 years ago, what's the most important thing about winning an argument? I would have told you it was like strategy, or I would have had some like trick. But now I say the most important thing to having a constructive argument is empathy. You have to understand the other person on their own terms, not on your terms. When most people think about why do other people believe what they believe, they tend to extend their own experiences, their own value systems, and they're saying like, well, if I was trying to believe that, why would I believe it? But that is not the right approach. You have to think about that other person. What is their background? What is their experience? What are their emotional reactions to things? And so only when you understand the person on their own terms can you understand why they believe the arguments they believe. Because otherwise they can just seem inexplicable. They can just seem bizarre to you.
Very interesting. So we started the program today mentioning we're going to be talking about disinformation. And this is a subject that actually I brought up with some other guests in previous interviews, because many of us, and I suspect yourself as well, view disinformation as actually a very serious threat to our democracy. And you and I are going to talk about it in some more detail. But I want to ask you, we've been through several different ages. We went through the Industrial Revolution. We went through the post-industrial revolution. We went through the age of information. And many people now, especially with the advent of artificial intelligence, are talking about the age of disinformation. Why is disinformation such a concern, especially as it relates to democracy and politics?
So that's a lot going on there. So if I'm going to try to unpack some parts of it, the first thing that I always like to say is, the question is, does the current technology create anything that is genuinely a new issue, or is it simply more, bigger, faster? And there are some genuinely new issues, but for the most part, what the current information technology has done is simply accelerate trends that were always present. Was there bullying before? Yep, there was bullying before. Now there's cyberbullying. Were there scams before done through paper mail? Yep, there sure were. Now there are scams that are done through email. So it's often a question of scale and speed is really what makes this era distinctive. And part of what has enabled that is algorithms and other forms of artificial intelligence which allow these scams to be perpetuated or allow disinformation to spread at essentially an inhuman speed, at a speed that a human being could never replicate, and therefore which is fairly bewildering and hard for us to respond to.
I want to ask you, delve in a little more detail about political information.
Sure.
You and I are of a certain age that we grew up, well, I'm a little bit older, but grew up in an age when most of us got our political information from reading the Minneapolis Star, the Minneapolis Tribune. Used to have two daily newspapers. Now it's the Minnesota Star Tribune. And in the evening, we'd sit around the TV and we'd watch Walter Cronkite. There were four networks. The main networks provide, or three major networks, CBS, NBC, ABC, that gave us the nightly news. And for many Americans, I suspect millions of us who grew up in the 1960s, 70s, 80s even, that was where we got our information. Today, the number of places that people can get information has literally exploded. I mean, it's thousands and thousands of different places, podcasts, websites. But the proliferation of places we can get information does not necessarily mean that that information is reliable, does it?
No, not at all. And this is, I think, the paradox of the information age, that on the one hand, we have so much more information available to us, and yet the reliability or credibility of that information is now in doubt almost all the time. And the doubt which has been created by that lack of certainty has leached over into people being uncertain about mainstream sources that might be pursuing really high journalistic standards, and yet people have a distrust even in those media sources which are doing everything right and really have a high level of integrity and quality to their information.
Right, meaning that a professional journalist is trained literally to test information. Is it true? To develop sources, to develop backup sources. You don't just take one person's word for what's happening. But that's not necessarily true, is it, for a lot of blogs or social media posts that we see? And another thing, it seems like a lot of social media is merely reiterating or repeating what they've picked up from other blogs or other social media, isn't it?
With even no attempt to check whether that information was accurate in the first place. And I think there's a lot of what we're talking about here is at sort of the big scale, the macro scale of democracy and the major media. But all of these same things are happening to us as individuals on the micro scale at an individual level. So in the same way that somebody might receive on social media a rumor or some kind of terrible thing that somebody else supposedly did, and they might immediately post it or repost it or share it or send it along, we now see that same dynamic is occurring at the macro level, where people will receive stories that are completely unverified, videos that have never been checked, and they will simply post them up as fact on platforms that might have millions of followers.
So let's talk about, how do you define disinformation? And that may seem like a simple question, but actually, is it merely contradicting something that's a known provable fact? For example, today's Friday, you can verify that by looking at a calendar. That's not a subjective opinion, it's an objective fact. How do you define disinformation? Is there something more calculated to disinformation and more, frankly, sinister behind spreading disinformation?
Yeah, there is. I think people don't always make these delineations, but so disinformation is something that is being done deliberately in order to mislead people. Other forms of misinformation are simply information somebody got wrong. A mistake. Although I have to say that passing along bad information without checking it is, in my mind, a problem all by itself. And it might be as large or even a larger problem than people that are intentionally attempting to deceive us. Because the more that people get into the habit of simply passing along information without ever checking it, they allow for the people to perpetuate really terrible things that can be said about individuals. People can spread rumors about individuals that can be slanderous, can cause people to lose their jobs, can ruin relationships. And then at the macro level, we have that same dynamic causing people to be questioned whether they should still have a high public office, whether they should be elected or not, and then just undermining people's general trust in whether or not anybody saying anything can be trusted anymore. And that's not true, but it's created that general feeling in the public.
So it sort of created an atmosphere, if you will, where some people say, well, because I can't trust this, maybe I can't trust anything.
Exactly. And I
from
think,
anybody, from any source.
And that's a terrible disservice to all of the excellent journalists that are out there, to all of the excellent government servants that are out there doing excellent jobs who actually care about the facts. Unfortunately, the more that we have people in both government and the media and individuals sharing information without actually checking it, that undermines the entire nation. In fact, I have I have a pet peeve. One of my pet peeves is the idea that everything's a narrative, everything's a story. And that creates this idea that a story can be fictional. We can reconstruct anything we want, right? But that's a terrible way to look at the world, right? Stories can be fiction. I love stories. I love fictional stories. But I also want the real world to operate on empirical facts, facts that we can actually check. And if we lose this idea that facts matter, we risk undermining the entire trust that holds our society together and that makes the democracy work.
Mm-hmm. One of the most memorable moments, I think, in the first Trump administration was when we saw a White House press secretary step to the podium and told the American people there is such a thing as alternative facts.
Yep. Alternative facts, which especially in some of the things occurring in the early first Trump administration, which were demonstrably false, right? Like the size of his inauguration crowd versus the size of Obama's inauguration crowd. There were photos of that. There were hundreds of witnesses of that. There was video of that. It's demonstrably false. And yet they doubled down on that claim anyway. And to me, that is very dangerous. Like that's the kind of 1984 authoritarian dystopia where we're trying to convince people that you should believe me because I am the authority figure. Don't believe your own senses. Don't look at the photographs. Don't look at the facts. Mm-hmm. And that is one of the most dangerous things that can happen in a democracy.
So when we're doing this, it seems obvious that we're also talking very much about an ethical dimension here, the ethics of spreading information that you either know to be false or you didn't take the time to verify that it was true.
Yes, those are both ethical problems. And obviously the intentional one is a higher ethical concern, but the failure to check might be an even bigger practical concern because it's so easy to pass along information that you don't know if it's true or not. And yet you might send it along, not realizing that everybody else you send it to, they will all assume it's true because they'll assume you checked it, even if you didn't.
Mm-hmm. Bob, you mentioned a few moments ago that there are instances where people are generating AI. They have people in places they never were saying things that they never said, speaking to other people that never existed. I mean, we're in a whole brave new world or dangerous, scary new world here with this AI technology. But a really important question that I think policymakers are wrestling with, and we see this at both the federal and state level, how do you rein in that kind of disinformation when we have something such as the First Amendment that allows freedom of speech? And there is a distinction, to be sure. We know this in law. You can't slander or libel people. That's not protected speech. But where sometimes that line is a little bit gray, isn't it, between misinformation and actually deliberate disinformation?
Oh, yes. And I think you're right.
How do we reconcile that with the First Amendment? Don't people have a right to be wrong?
So people have a right to be wrong. And as you say, the First Amendment is not an unlimited guarantee of free expression, right? There are many exceptions to the First Amendment. Slander, defamation, fire in a crowded theater, those are all important exceptions to protected speech. But there are many things we can do within the bounds of the First Amendment that can try to stem these problems of deepfakes and of, I think deepfakes, by the way, are also only, I think, just the tip of the iceberg. The next thing that's coming is the creation of deep avatars. Avatars where they've trained like you've been on TV a lot, so we have a lot of audio. There's a lot of video out there. It would be quite easy for somebody to create an avatar of you, which could then be programmed to say anything they wanted it to say. And it would be very difficult unless you have technical skills to be able to examine the digital code in the file.
Which I don't.
Which most people don't. Almost nobody does. It would be very difficult to prove that that was fake. But the technical aspects also point us in direction of a lot of different solutions. So we could pass laws, for example, that make it illegal to engage in certain types of deepfakes. And we can couch those under slander, for example. And slander and defamation, we already have a body of law there that distinguishes between things about fact and things about opinion. We could pass laws that said companies were responsible for content that was on their sites. We could, for example, pass laws that say that you must produce the metadata that's attached to files, and that metadata must be retained and made available to the public. And in that case, then we could verify whether this was actually something that Steve said or whether this was something that somebody had created. So there's many possible remedies to this. Unfortunately, the technology is advancing very fast, and there's a heavy political lobby that doesn't want any regulation on AI or on deepfakes.
It seems that the technology is outstripping the ability or the speed of Congress and state legislatures to respond to this, isn't it?
So I'm a bit of a skeptic on that one. I know that's a very common thing that people say, and it's definitely true to some extent. Like in my classes, when the examples that I use one semester of deepfakes are outmoded by the time I teach it in the next semester. So the technology is moving at a very rapid pace. But the truth of the matter is that Congress and most legislatures haven't really tried to do much of anything to rein this in. And that's really a political problem, where we have a large number of people who have billions of dollars to spend, and they don't want this industry to be regulated. They want this industry to be able to do whatever it wants to do because that's how they're going to make the most money the fastest. So I think there's both a technical problem, there's a legal problem, but there's a political problem where Congress and legislatures could be doing many things if they were willing to step outside the influence of these industries.
Very interesting. Being a professor, obviously you work with a lot of young people. You teach mostly young people. And you were the subject, you were quoted in a story that ran in the Minnesota Star Tribune back on December 7th, 2025. You teach a class called Defense Against the Dark Arts. How, again, what was the reaction of your students to that class when you were exploring these themes of disinformation? Are students, do you think, more savvy to disinformation than older people maybe? Are they less susceptible? And what did you learn? What feedback did you get from students that you were teaching?
Yeah. Well, the first time I taught it, I had disappointment in a few students who showed up and thought it was going to be a class about Harry Potter, which it is not. No. It is a class about the dark arts of persuasion, so all the ways in which persuasion can be abused. Some of those are technological, like the AI deepfakes, use of social media algorithms. Many of them are about propaganda, disinformation, radicalization, enculturation, that kind of stuff. But are students more liable to it? I would say young people today, in one way, are more savvy because they're used to using the technology. But in another way, that also makes them far more vulnerable because they have learned from a young age to trust that technology. That technology feels like a normal part of social interaction to them. And as a result, although they might be less inclined to trust some forms of mass media, they're more inclined to trust information that's coming from other individuals that they think are within their social network. So, for example, a slanderous accusation about somebody that they've never met, but which arrives through their social network, is very likely to be believed by a young person, more likely to be believed by a young person than an older person that didn't grow up with that technology. So.
That's very interesting. And as I recall reading the article, your students were examining, I believe it was an example of artificial intelligence photograph or something, and that it was noted in the story that they were actually able to identify the fake from the real
Yep.
photograph, right?
So-
What were the cues that tipped them off to what was fake and what was real?
Yeah, so we do, part of that class is we run through a whole series of examples over the course of several weeks. Some of them are examples of texting scams, for example. Some of them are examples of email scams. And so for each one of them, I put up examples on the board. I do 3 at a time. And then I say, can you identify which one of these is fake? Oh, by the way, they're all real. They're all drawn from actual situations.
Okay.
And then we were doing fake images and then fake video. And there's a few ways that you can tell right now. And I'll give you some of the tips, but I have to point out the technology is improving so rapidly that I don't think these tips are going to be useful for much longer. So one of the things, for example, that AI images and video have great difficulty doing is hands. Human hands are very difficult. The AI tends to give too many fingers, or the fingers are not in the right
6
place.
fingers.
Oh yeah, 6 fingers or 7 fingers, or the fingers will be overlapping. More recent AI images, they try to cover that program by they blur the image around the hands in order to make so you can't tell that the image is wrong, even though the AI still couldn't do it right. They tend to create faces that are too perfect because the nature of the graphing software creates highly symmetrical faces. People's skin tends to be too perfect. Even when they create imperfections, the imperfections are too systematic. The crow's feet around somebody's eyes will be perfectly laid out instead of erratic the way they really are. In general, they also have problems with more fast-moving objects in video. So like one of the examples I use in that class is is this a real video of people walking down a street with some horses? And if you watch closely, you can see the person actually goes into one of the horses and then comes out the other side of the horse. The tail on the horse will appear and then disappear over time, things like that. So there's a variety of those small things, but you wouldn't notice them when you first watch it. They're quite convincing if you don't pay much attention.
That's very interesting, Bob. We're down to about 2 minutes. I want to ask you about the repercussions of a landmark U.S. Supreme Court ruling that came down in 2010. It was decided very narrowly, 5-4 decision, in the case of Citizens United versus the Federal Communications Commission. The majority basically held that laws restricting spending by corporations and unions on political campaigns and advertisements were unconstitutional. Basically removed the limits on the amounts that they can spend on these types of campaigns. And one of the more memorable phrases that came out of Citizens United was the description, corporations are people too. Are corporations people too, the same as you and I?
No, clearly not. And in my opinion, that is one of the worst Supreme Court decisions that has been made, one of the most destructive to democracy.
Why is it so destructive
So
to
I have to
democracy?
combine that. So Citizens United is the one that everybody knows about, but we have to combine it with another Supreme Court decision that came earlier called Buckley v. Vallejo. And what Buckley v. Vallejo said was that money counts as speech. The availability of money counts as speech. And when combined with the number of people that are involved, essentially what Citizens United done is it says that collectively an organization that has a lot of money therefore has a right to use that money as speech. And I can, like right now, I'm a campaign manager for the Matt Little for Congress campaign, and I can just tell you the degree to which that decision has undermined the integrity of the political process, most people do not understand. I think they have a general idea, but most people could not understand what a corrupting influence that has all throughout the political process.
I just want to end, we're down to the end here.
Yep.
Justice Stevens in his dissent, very memorable quote, I thought, a democracy cannot function effectively when its constituent members believe laws are being bought and sold.
Right.
And that really puts it in a nutshell.
Yes, it
Professor Bob Groven, Associate Professor and Co-Chair, Department of Communications at Augsburg University, thank you for being our guest today on Access to Democracy.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.